Plant charm, plant pet, plant ant? Hi there, welcome to the Upcycle Design Lab. If you're new here, my name's Cindy and I craft using recycled and repurposed materials to give you ideas on ways to make and create more economically and ecologically. Today's video is going to be a little longer than my normal content because I'm going to take you all the way through the process step by step on how I made these cute little plant creatures from aluminum cans. And since this is going to be a longer video, I do want to direct you to the description box of this video, which will have a lot of other resources if you're interested. And also be sure to check the timestamp area so that you can jump to the portion of the tutorial that you're interested in. For this project, you're going to need one aluminum can, and I've taken the top off of mine just because I like to save some of the different parts of the can. You don't need to worry about doing that for this project. You can just start with a full aluminum can. You need a ruler of some sort, some E6000 glue or Gorilla Clear glue. You just want to make sure it's clear and strong. A pair of scissors. I just use a paring knife to start the cuts on my can, so that's why I have a knife here. You're going to want a glue stick, a small dowel, and a toothpick. And then I've got a couple of pliers here, a needle nose pair and a special jewelry pair that has the round tips on them. You're also going to need a couple of small black round beads. I think these are about 5 or 6 millimeters. You need some jewelry wire, and I'm going to be using 22 gauge. You can also use 20 gauge. The 20 gauge is a little sturdier and it's a little bit more difficult to work with. So if you're just starting out, you might want to start with a 22 gauge. You also need some metal tape. This, you only need a tiny bit, but I use this metal tape with a lot of my aluminum can projects. I think you can get a roll for around $9 or $10, and it's just kind of a fun resource to have, I think. It's very easy to work with because it has paper backing, so you can measure and cut it to whatever size you want, and it's pretty easy to work with because of that paper backing. It's not a terribly strong tape, but it is very tacky, and it's easy to shape. You also need a bead template, which I will link to in the description. And there's a PDF format, which is just printable, which is what I'll be using to demonstrate this today. There'll also be an SVG file if you want to cut the beads on a Cricut cutting machine. And if you're interested in doing that, I have done some other videos. I'll link to those resources as well for how to cut aluminum cans on your Cricut cutting machine. But I know a lot of people don't have a Cricut cutting machine, so today I'm just going to be using a paper template, and we're going to cut the beads by hand. The last thing you're going to need is a bead roller, and I haven't rolled a lot of beads, so I haven't tested out a lot of different bead rollers, but this one works very well for working with aluminum cans, and I think it's about $14 or something on Amazon. I'll put a link to that in the description as well, but it's been a really simple tool to use, and it just helps you hold the aluminum because it's a little bit stiffer and more difficult to roll than paper is. So that's everything you need to make this project, and the first thing you want to do is cut down the can. And like I said, I just start my cuts with a paring knife. You can use an X-Acto knife or whatever you have around, and I'm going to cut the top portion off right at right where the curve of the can is. Be careful. And I just use the knife to start my cuts, and then I finish it with the scissors just because it's faster and cleaner. And like I said, I save these pieces of my can because I can use them for other projects. And then I'm just going to cut down the center and trim off the bottom. And I'll save this piece as well. And now I've got a big mess there, so let me clean that up. The next thing I want to do is flatten this piece out, and if you are cutting your aluminum on a Cricut cutting machine, I would recommend using the iron method for flattening your piece of aluminum, just because you want it to be really flat when you run it through the Cricut cutting machine. Since I'm hand cutting these today, I'm just going to use the reverse roll method and sort of straighten it out on the edge of a table or my chair. If you're interested in using the ironing method for flattening your aluminum cans, I'll put a link to a tutorial I did on 3 different ways to flatten aluminum cans in the description box for you to check out. So I call this the reverse roll method for flattening cans, and you can see that it's not perfectly flat, but it will be just fine for this project. So the next thing I want to do is take the paper template, and I'm just going to use my glue stick to stick it to the printed side of the aluminum can. But this template can be a little bit confusing, so you can see the red lines here, and I'm just going to quickly draw a line through here so that I know that this is actually scrap piece. Once I start cutting it, it gets a little confusing. So I'm just going to trim down my template here. And then you can see it fits nicely on this piece of aluminum. So I'm just going to, you don't want to use too much glue because you want to be able to just easily pull the paper off once you're done cutting. But I like to use the glue stick instead of tape, because the tape, if you tape it, it kind of allows the paper to move around, and you want your cuts to be pretty precise. So you want your template to lay nice and flat across the aluminum. So I've got 2 different types of beads here. I'm going to cut these straight pieces. So these are going to be 3 separate beads that are just make up the body of the ant. And then these 3 bead pieces actually fit together into one long strip to make the head. You want to be pretty precise on your cutting here, because especially on this piece, because all of these pieces kind of need to fit together. So once you've got the piece cut, you can go ahead and pull the paper off, and hopefully it comes off pretty easily. If you have any paper stuck to the aluminum, you can get it off with a little bit of water pretty easily. So you can see this piece I just cut off looks kind of like a part of the bead shape, so that's why I drew that line there, so I'd know that that's actually scrap. So you should have a wide end and a narrow end for all three of these pieces, and then they're just going to fit together into one long strand. But let me finish cutting the rest of these pieces first. I think I mentioned that I haven't rolled a ton of paper beads, but I have really enjoyed using this bead roller to make a lot of different aluminum can beads. I've made some different jewelry pieces. I've made a dragonfly in a similar style to this ant project that we're working on. And I'm also working on a similar project to make an aluminum can beaded butterfly. So stay tuned for that tutorial as well. When you're done cutting, you should have 3 tapered pieces to make the head. And you'll have 3 1/4-inch pieces that are going to roll into 3 separate beads to make up the body. All right, so these are the 3 1/4-inch pieces. We'll just set those aside for a minute. And I'm going to get my metal tape out. I'm going to cut about a 3.5-inch piece, 3 to 4 inches. And I'm going to find my widest tapered piece and the next piece, and I want to tape on the aluminum colored side or the non-printed side, and I'm just going to cut a strip that's about as wide as the small end of my large piece. It doesn't have to be perfect because you can trim it down when after you get them taped together. And then I'm just going to peel back a little bit of the paper and attach the tape to the narrow end of my largest piece. And then I can remove the tape and just line the pieces up. They should match pretty closely in width. If they don't, you can trim them down slightly as well. So I've got my 2 pieces hooked together there, and I'm just going to trim off the excess tape. So I'm just going to take the smallest piece and go through the same process, taping it together so I have one long tapered piece. If you're enjoying today's content and you like to recycle and upcycle things into new things, I hope you'll consider clicking that subscribe button and joining my YouTube family. You can click the bell icon to select your notification preferences and join me every week for a new tutorial. And then before I roll this bead, I want to add one more piece of tape to the very tip of the metal here. And I'm going to taper it to a really distinctive point at the very end and kind of just taper it down to make it about the width of the tip of my metal piece. So you can see that that's got a nice taper to it. And I'm just going to attach it to the end of my metal here, but I don't want to remove the paper all the way yet. So I'll take it back about 3/4 of an inch and attach it again to the silver side of my aluminum here. So I've attached this tapered piece to the very end, and I want to leave the paper on. Because this is aluminum and it's a little more difficult to work with than paper, I have found that I need to start rolling the aluminum around a small dowel, and I just roll it a couple of times around. And then this is kind of too big of a roll, so I try to kind of just tighten up that coil with my fingers. And when you get it about as small as you can, then you're ready to actually put it onto the bead roller. So like I said, this bead roller is pretty easy to use. I'm just going to slide my coil through the two little metal pieces here. You might have to slide this little pressure arm out of the way, but it does help you to hold the bead, so that makes it much easier. And then once you've got it on there, you can just turn the handle to coil the bead. You might need to adjust it here and there. Sometimes you want to pull it a little tighter. And when you get to the first seam, you're going to find that it wants to kind of have a little bit of an edge to it. That's just sort of unavoidable. So you can kind of reshape it once you have the bead totally rolled together, but it does sort of have a little bit of a edge to it, I guess, where you've pieced the pieces together. It's not always perfectly smooth. And now that I've gotten to the tip, I can go ahead and remove the paper, and I'm just going to let the tape roll around and hold the bead together. And then you can kind of push the lever down and slide your bead off. If you want to, you can try to reshape it a little bit. Sometimes they don't roll as perfectly as you might want them to, but you can slide the coils around a little bit. To reshape them. So that's the bead for the head. And then I'm just going to add a piece of tape that's about 1/4 inch wide to one end of all of my 1/4 inch strips. You can mark and measure these if you want a little bit more accurate piece of tape, but I usually just kind of eyeball it. And again, I want to leave the paper on until I have the bead rolled. So I'm just going to attach about 1 inch or 3/4 of an inch to the end of each piece of metal. Oops, you want to get it straighter than that. You can see it's very sticky. All right, let's try that again. There we go. So I'm just going to attach a piece of the tape to each piece of aluminum, and then I'll roll the beads the same way I did the other bead. I'm going to start it again on my wooden skewer. Roll it a few times. Tighten up the coil with my fingers. And then put it onto the bead roller. You can pull it a little to tighten it, like I said, if you want to. Oh, I'm rolling this the wrong way. What a dummy. Oh, dear me. I mean, I guess you could roll it the wrong way. This aluminum's pretty forgiving. If you fold it, it will break, but if you coil it or, you know, bend it, it's actually pretty forgiving. So I think I'll be able to turn this around. There we go. All right, so coiling it a few times, tightening the coil, and sliding it onto the bead roller. And there you've got your first 1/4 inch coil bead. There's the second bead. The thing I like about this bead roller is that it's got this little tension bar on it, which helps to hold the aluminum. So that's, I think, a feature that a lot of bead rollers don't have, but that's why I recommend this bead roller. I just want to show you a different angle of how I roll the beads here. Maybe it gives you a little bit better view. But like I said, I'm just rolling it around the dowel and then tightening the coil. It's okay if you flatten it out a little bit. And then you'll see there's 2 little bars on this. I'm going to slide my coil between the 2. And then again, just turn the handle. And you can see it's coiling kind of loosely, so that's what I mean about pulling it a little tighter. You want to pull on it gently so you don't break the bead roller, but you can kind of tighten up the coil. And then this will also, there's a lever here that also helps to keep pressure on the bead as you're rolling it. So you can work as quickly or as slowly as you feel comfortable. And like I said, I'm just removing my paper backing from the tape and wrapping the bead to hold it tight. Now sometimes when you're taking the bead off of the roller, you want to push this little lever down, and you can sometimes unwind the beads. If you pull just on the outside, you can sort of, this one's coming off pretty cleanly, but sometimes it'll sort of start to uncoil. So you might need to get a grip behind the bead and just slide it off, and you can push the coils back together if you need to. The next thing I want to do is cut my wire, and I need 2 6-inch pieces and 2 3-inch pieces. They don't have to be perfect, but just get them close. And you can probably use your scissors for this. If your scissors won't cut the wire, if you're using a little heavier wire, go ahead and use your pliers. And once you've got your 6-inch pieces cut, we're going to start with those. And I'm just going to cut my 3-inch pieces and set them aside for the moment. I want to take one of my 6-inch pieces, and I'm using my round tipped jewelry pliers, and I'm just going to coil a loose coil a couple of times around on both pieces of my wire. So I'm going to do the same process again on this second piece of wire. keeping the coil nice and loose. And it's easier to work with the wire if you kind of straighten it out with your fingers a little bit. So let's do that for the next step. And you can see the two coils I've got there. So now we're ready for the beads. I'm going to start with my two black beads, and I'm going to take one of my wires and just thread the black bead through. Take the other wire. And now I want to find my large bead that I rolled from the 3 pieces of tapered metal taped together. And I'm just going to thread my wires through in opposite directions through this bead. So this part is going to be the antenna, and the lengths of wire that I'm using allow for about a 1-inch antenna. So I'm just going to hold my bead, and I'm going to fold the wire up on both sides where the coil is to make about a 1-inch length of wire. I'm going to hold the antennas so that where I've bent the wire is tight to the bead, and then I'm going to fold the other 2 wires underneath the bead and across each other. And the next twist is a little bit, you want to be a little bit careful. You want to make sure that you're twisting the wire right in the center of the bead. So just that first turn, you want to be careful about holding the wires in the right position. And once you've got that first turn, you can go ahead and twist the wires 2 or 3 more times just to make a little bit of length of wire for the neck. If you mess up and you kind of get your wires off to the side, you can unwrap them, straighten them out a little bit, and twist them again to get them in the center of the bead. So I'm just going to twist this a couple more times. And now we're ready to add the 3 beads to make the body. This first bead is a little bit tricky to get flat, so I like to kind of hold it in place and then bend the wires at a 90-degree angle around the bead so that you have sort of a square shape to the wire. And then I'm going to kind of curve the ends here toward each other. So again, we're going to put the wires going through the bead in opposite directions. And then you can kind of gently pull on the wires until they fit flat up into that notch that you folded in the wire. If you're using heavier gauge wire, you may need to use your pliers to pull the wires tight, but this 22 gauge is pretty easy to get pulled tight just with your hands. I have a little bit too much lotion on my hands right now. So you can see how that first bead kind of fits flat where you've bent the wire to make it fit horizontally with the top bead. The next 2 beads are going to go on the same way, and they're a little bit easier to put on just because the wires are separated and not twisted at the top now. So I'm just going to feed the wire, each wire through the bead, and pull it tight to the next bead. Feed the wire through, feed the other wire through. And pull it tight. So the excess wire here is going to end up being the back legs of your ant, and you're ready to use your other 2 pieces of wire, and they're just going to thread through each of the center of each of the other 2 beads. So I'm going to feed it through the center bead and then try to fold it pretty close to the middle so that you have even lengths on both sides. So next I'm going to take my toothpick and a little bit of E6000 glue, and I just want to put a tiny bit of glue inside each of my beads on both sides to secure the wires, and also a little bit of glue up here to attach the eyes so that they don't slide up and down on the antenna. I use the toothpick just because I need a tiny bit of glue, and I tend to overdo it if I don't have something smaller. This also kind of helps you to get some of the glue inside of the bead, so it'll help secure the bead itself and also the legs so that they aren't swinging around and the ant won't stand up if you have the legs really loose. So we want to get them secured, and like I said, secure the bead a little bit as well. If you've never used E6000 glue, it takes about a full 24 hours to completely cure, but it will set up pretty quickly. It's a flexible glue, so even if you don't get the legs positioned exactly the way you want them, you can probably adjust them at the end. And it does take a little bit of time to set up, so it's very forgiving to work with. So I'm going to get all my glue in the places where I want it, and then I'll adjust the legs, make sure they're kind of straight. Not crisscrossing each other. All right. So now I want to let the glue set up for an hour or so before I start fiddling with the leg. Now that the glue is set up, I want to go ahead and trim off some of the excess to make all of the legs similar in length. So I need to trim a little bit off the back 2 pieces of wire here. And then I'm going to use the tip of the pliers again just to roll another coil to make the feet and so that this will stand up. But in this case, I'm going to roll some really tight coils 2 or 3 times, depending on how long you want the legs to be. But you can see that I'm keeping the coil together and not rolling it loosely like I did on the antenna. For mine, I'm making about 3 turns. It also kind of depends on how big you're making them, how far down on the tip of the pliers that you're working. But you want to make them fairly similar. And you want to roll them all the same direction. So I'm rolling outward, so on the other side I'm going to roll the opposite direction. Once you've got the feet all coiled up and your legs are pretty much the same length, you can go ahead and shape the ant. You're going to need to tip his head back if you want him to stand up, because you have to kind of equalize the weight. And then I like to turn the antenna and curve them a little bit. But you can kind of do whatever your preference is. Make them straighter or send them out a little bit. And I think I'm going to shorten up these legs all like another turn, just because they seem a little long at this point. If your ant isn't standing up, you want to make sure that the back legs aren't too long, because it will have a tendency to tip forward. So if you make the back legs just a tiny bit shorter and the middle legs, just kind of keep them from being longer than the front legs as well, that will help it to stand up also. And then you can just kind of separate the legs a little bit. Like I said, you can shape the wire any way you want to, really. And then he should stand up. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, check out my dragonfly project by clicking or tapping your screen now. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you back here soon in the lab for my next experiment.